So let's talk about the reality of fear from two sides. Let me give you an example. Police are fearful of getting in a situation where they're going to be harmed or do the wrong thing on one side, and a lot of folks of color are fearful that the police are going to shoot them down, knock them down, abuse them, or whatever. So they're both in fearful spots. And what I tell you, fear creates confusion, and confusion distorts perception, right? And it can actually create conditions that make it appear as if one thing is occurring when actually it's not. And it can create conditions that trigger both sides to react in ways that are dangerous to both sides. And when that occurs, the probabilities increase of something going sideways, unintendedly on both sides. That's what fear does. It creates those kinds of conditions, right? And both sides are in, they're both being fed propaganda and lies, right? All that's being amped up, right? So that creates the conditions for more events to occur, right? That's what I mean by you're being deceived. You're being socially engineered into destructive things occurring at a macro level all the way down to the micros. Now apply what I just told you to nation states, right? As it is for people, so too it is for nations. So when you're both in a position of adversarial perception, right? You're both looking at the potential for war, right? And you're being fed lies, or you're being deceived, or your own pride is deceiving you. I want you to think about how that plays out by applying what I told you at the micros between the police officer and the people of color. Because the only difference is, right, the scale, right? As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Now think about the probabilities increasing for an unintended event, consequences to occur, and how that increases the vulnerability to all the adversarial parties, making it more likely for conflict to actually occur, to be triggered. And it gives power to a third party that may intend on actually creating those conditions and then taking advantage of them by creating a situation that sparks those conflicts. Now think about what I just told you. That's what I mean by triggered cascade effects at a geostrategic level. The same thing that plays out between nation states is the same thing that plays out between the police officer who's in a highly stressful situation. There's a lot of unknowns. They've been a pressure cooker for a while, plus they're being fed all this information, right, that's going off on them, putting the public against them, right, which increases their stress load, right, their fear quotient, which distorts perceptions. And then flip of the other side, you've got all these folks, right, black folks, that are freaking out because they're being fed lies, right, and being amped up and made even more fearful, right, towards the police officers, creating a binary situation that third parties can actually take advantage of and have plausible deniability because they didn't actually trigger the direct event, they only created the conditions. Both sides are actually more alike and have more in common than they have in differences, but they're both in the same spot and they're being taken advantage of. Both sides have high stress levels, they're living in lots of fear, right, a lot of uncertainty, and they're leverages pride, fear, confusion, stress levels, and it dopes it on both sides with bad information, propaganda. It's a self-destruction cycle. It's very important you understand this, all right? The folks that are ignoring this, right, particularly in the press, do so at their own peril. Right? If your bottom line and trying to get viewership is more important than doing actual journalism, you're no longer a journalist, you're a propagandist for what I call, right, cannibal capitalism, where you're actually creating conditions and devouring people for the bottom line. That's evil. In my book, it's an act of war and sedition. Now consider that in terms of yellow journalism and how these things can spark cascade effects between nations and create conditions for war or spark war outright. This is what I mean by as for people, so too it is for nations. There's nothing new under the sun. All right, if you don't understand this, it's because you've chosen not to look at it. You've chosen not to understand it, right? If you know it and you're doing it anyway, you're in denial because you're gaining something from it, which means you're complicit with the very evil I'm talking about, and thereby you're culpable for it. That should clear it up a little more. Because as we head into this season and you've got all these potentials for higher levels of social unrest, right? That's destabilization. That's destabilization operations, right? You're being destabilized from within, from your own avarice and hubris in positions of leadership and positions of influence, as well as externally. And that creates the conditions, right? That pit everybody against everybody, right? Like on my OTL website, right? The war of all against all. That's what it's trying to create. It's trying to create a position where everybody is adversarial to everybody and creates destruction, conflict. That's what happens when fear, confusion, right? And disinformation and pride mixed together. That's a strong drink. Now, when a news agency or even an individual is knowingly sowing bad information, right, for whatever reason, whether to get for the bottom line or because they want to cover their own pride, for their greed or for their pride, what they're doing is sowing the wind, right? They're seeding people's minds with lies, with confusion, and with fear. There's consequences for that. Okay? When you sow the wind, right? And remember, how do you, when you're sowing seed, what do we call that in agriculture? We use a broadcaster. So if you're sowing bad seed, right? You're sowing the wind. And if you're sowing the wind, you're going to reap a whirlwind of consequences, and it's always in destruction. That's why I keep trying to tell you, nothing is hidden. And what is about to occur soon, and you can deny it all you want, is because you're not awake or because you don't care, you're going to get your damn consequences. And they're going to be proportional to the macro level effect that you've had on individuals, the entire nation, and rippling around the world. That is what you are responsible for. So I would highly suggest you step back from the abyss and consider what I'm telling you. Seriously. And those of you that want to continue to play these games with the public so that you can get more money, so you can make more money, get more viewership, you CNN, well, guess what? By doing that, you're making yourself a target, and a very easy one, because you won't be able to hide behind your broadcasting equipment when the whirlwind comes. Do you understand? As it is for people, so too it is for nations.